So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the Supreme Court arguments that we heard last week. I will say I live streamed it with my criminal justice students at George Washington University, and I wasn't quite sure what to say to them at the conclusion of it. But let's just say it didn't go well for democracy. It didn't go well for the integrity of our elections. It didn't go well on the disqualification front, but I'd be interested to know what your kind of top line takeaways were from what you heard, and how do you think that impacts your work going forward in trying to disqualify insurrectionists from holding office?
First, let me hit the top line, which is that the Supreme Court is prepared to reverse the Colorado Supreme Court and say that Trump cannot be disqualified from Colorado state ballots. That's clear to any observer that that's where they're headed. It may be 8-1, it may be 9-0. Now, the unfortunate aspect about that is that they started with the conclusion and then they were grasping at arguments to lead to that conclusion. And if they actually thought that Donald Trump did not engage in insurrection, that would be an easy way to resolve the case. But none of them have the gall to say that, and none of them during oral argument actually wanted to touch that issue. There was almost no discussion of whether Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. They could have talked about what does the word insurrection mean in the Constitution? What does it mean to engage in insurrection? But none of them wanted to confront the merits of the case. Instead, they were grasping at ways to avoid needing to decide it, whether the president is an officer or whether states which under our electoral college system choose electors for the electoral college that chooses the president, whether they're allowed to control their own ballots. And they're looking for a way out of it. And the only question is which way or ways will they choose? What impact will that have on later processes like the congressional counting of the votes on January 6th, 2025? And what type of legal precedent does it set for the future? And what kind of message does it send to Trump and to other insurrectionists? And we don't know the answers to those questions, but we do know that it's going to be almost certainly a loss.
So let me ask the procedural question. What does this do to your challenge, for example, in Illinois? Does it just kind of de facto put everything on hold, or do you just keep moving forward and wait for the Supreme Court to rule?
We're moving forward. So, in fact, Trump's lawyer asked the judge in Illinois to stay the proceedings, and she said no. So he's appealed that to a higher court in Illinois, and we're now briefing that. The judge's view in the Illinois Circuit Court was that she's got an obligation to decide the case, and the Supreme Court is going to do what it's going to do, when it's going to do, but in the meantime, she's going to evaluate the facts and the law. So there is a bit of a scheduling uncertainty there because we don't know how soon the U.S. Supreme Court will issue its decision or what its basis will be. But in the meantime, we're proceeding ahead with our cases.
I'm glad to hear the states are still in the business of administering their elections. That's refreshing and necessary and constitutional. So let me just ask you, because I'm still groping for answers myself as to what I heard last week in that Supreme Court argument. My take on this, maybe just being a trial guy, is that a trial was held on the merits at which both fact witnesses and expert witnesses testified. Donald Trump had every right to be fully represented and to call witnesses and to make arguments. And after all of that, a trial court judge in Colorado made a factual finding that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. That, of course, is a finding that was affirmed by the Colorado State Supreme Court. So if we start from the premise that courts have ruled Donald Trump engaged in insurrection, and if we additionally start with the understanding that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says, therefore, somebody who has engaged in insurrection is disqualified from holding office unless the disability is removed by Congress by a 2/3 vote. I thought, silly me, that was going to be a topic of discussion because that is the big picture, the constitutional picture. And what I heard, even from some what I consider to be well-regarded justices, were these debates over semantics. What does office versus officer versus office holder mean? It's like, wait a minute, folks. You're putting details over democracy. Now, I'm not dismissing details as being important to constitutional interpretation, But I think what's more important is all of the ingredients are there. The legal and constitutional ingredients are there for disqualification. And the court didn't seem to be concerned one whit about the big constitutional picture. What's your take on all of that?
It's frankly astonishing that in well over an hour of oral argument, there was almost no discussion about whether Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. Because if some of the justices wanted to say that, they could have. Even Trump's own lawyer really didn't want to defend what he did on the merits, didn't want to say January 6th wasn't an insurrection, didn't want to say Trump didn't engage in it. In fact, Trump's position now is that it was an insurrection, just that it was caused by Nancy Pelosi.
Or Nikki Haley, right. To be fair.
Right. Well, yeah, Nikki Haley was, Speaker of the House at some point in Trump's mind. Yeah. So it is really unfortunate that they were obviously just looking for a way out, a way to say, well, this can't possibly be what happens, without actually confronting the serious issues and trying to navigate around contradicting their own precedent in the past. And so sometimes that involves making, or exploring at least, ridiculous arguments, like whether the presidency is an office under the United States. The Constitution calls the presidency an office 24 times, and it is the president of the United States. And somebody who holds an office is an officer. That is literally the definition of officer. Or whether it's going back on their previous precedent about states and their role in the Electoral College. And it's almost ridiculous to hear them say, how do states have power in choosing the president? Have you read Article 2 of the Constitution? Have you read your own decision in Bush versus Gore? This is for better or worse. Often for worse, but this is for better or worse. The system that we have is the Electoral College system, and states run elections. And it's really sad that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to duck this issue in a way that will encourage other insurrectionists, would certainly give them impunity, and could lead to a chaotic situation on January 6th, 2025, depending how the election goes.
Yeah, whether it's a states' rights issue that, the Supreme Court, at least a certain block of Supreme Court justices, seem to be real states' rights devotees at times. And then at other times, my head wanted to explode when I heard Justice Kavanaugh wringing his hands about how this would result in inconsistency among the states. And it's, like, oh, you mean when you threw women's constitutionally protected privacy interests out the window and turned it back to the states? And now we have not just inconsistency, but what I would call deadly chaos in some states like Texas in the way they're dealing with, a woman's right to control her own reproductive health decisions. But now inconsistency is a real issue with guys like Brett Kavanaugh. I don't want to single him out, because there was sort of something to dislike with respect to what all of the justices were articulating, because, as you say, none of them seem to care about the big picture, which is that after a trial on the merits, he was found to have engaged in constitution. And as we all know, once factual findings of a trial court go up on appeal, ordinarily they are entitled to great deference unless they are clearly erroneous or without record support. Again, another tried and true principle of our court system. All of it seemed to be either ignored or just tossed out the window by this Supreme Court. So let me ask you, and I certainly agree with you that they are going to find an exit ramp. How does that inform your work moving forward?
Well, it depends exactly on the basis on which they rule. So they could rule in a way that simply says that states can't do this, but Congress can. And this is not the ideal way to handle things. Let me be clear. And one of the reasons that we and crew filed these challenges very early on in these state systems with time to allow appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court is so that these issues could be decided on the merits in plenty of time and not in a chaotic situation. But if the Supreme Court rules that this is a matter that states can't deal with, that leaves it to Congress. Then what happens is, depending on the results of the election, after the people have spoken, Congress, in counting the electoral votes on January 6th, 2025, might consider this question, whether Trump is constitutionally ineligible. Now, that is not the ideal way to resolve it, but Congress is supposed to be the last party involved in certifying the election. And if the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled out the more sensible ways of doing it, that may be an avenue where that issue gets raised. On the other hand, if the court comes up with one of these ridiculous arguments like the president is not an officer or the presidency is not an office, something like that, and says that as a, as a ruling of constitutional law, that would probably foreclose Congress, unless they wanted to really, be confrontational against the Supreme Court, from ruling on it. So that's part of why the way that the Supreme Court tries to wriggle out of this could really affect what happens next.
Any idea when you think we may see a decision?
It's hard to predict exactly. Sometimes they can move very quickly. Bush v. Gore was, I think, 24 hours between argument and decision. I think in this case, they don't perceive quite that rush, but they're probably going to issue it in the relatively near future because they are aware of the, ongoing primary elections and so on.
We're burning democracy daylight, as I always say. So do you have a few minutes to chat about presidential immunity? Because it's not only interesting, but timely, because today, Monday, February 12th, is the day that Donald Trump will, I'm going to go out on a limb there, will file with the Supreme Court trying to stay or stop or pause his trial, his prosecution in DC for trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. By the time people are watching this, Donald Trump will have already filed that request for a stay. If you have any thoughts, I know there's a lot to talk about when it comes to absolute presidential immunity, or as I call it, absolute presidential unicorn immunity, because there is no such thing in any federal statute, in any appellate court opinion, or in any of the language of the Constitution that supports the notion that a president is absolutely immune from prosecution for crimes he commits while in office. How do you see this playing out, both on the stay front and then on the substantive front? And I'm really interested to hear whether you think the Supreme Court will accept review of this case or not.
So, to step back a moment, in England, the king could not violate the law because the law came from the king in some respect. And certainly the prosecutorial power came from the king. We have a very different system here in the United States of America, which is that no one is above the law, not even the president. Now, obviously, nobody wants abusive prosecutions for political purposes against presidents, but Trump was arguing that he should have unlimited, absolute presidential immunity for any crime he committed while he was in office. And that is just fundamentally contradictory to our constitutional position. And the DC Circuit Court of Appeals said very clearly at the beginning of its decision that he is no longer President Trump for this purpose. He is Citizen Trump. He is subject to the same rights, the same liabilities as any other United States citizen. And so the DC Circuit meticulously picked apart his arguments. One of the most galling argument he made was that because he had been impeached but not convicted in the Senate, because the vote in the Senate was 57 to convict, but you need 2/3, that he couldn't then be criminally tried, which was the exact opposite of the argument that his defenders made in the impeachment proceeding. They said, let this be a matter for the criminal justice system, but not for a Senate conviction in an impeachment proceeding, which is a political decision, not a criminal justice decision. So in terms of what the U.S. Supreme Court will do, there's been some speculation that they see this as some sort of grand bargain with the Section 3 issue, that they'll give him a win by requalifying him for Colorado, but then they won't help him out with the immunity issue. Whether they take the case is a tactical decision, I suspect they won't. They don't need to. They can just leave the DC Circuit's decision there. It was a unanimous decision, including a Republican judge on the panel. There was no dissent, and there was really no issue left unaddressed that would be a basis for the Supreme Court to reverse on. So I think if they're smart, they'll just decline review.
Justice matters.